everybody. So I'm going to make a video this week. I'm a little nervous about it because I'm not following the prompt. I'm going to focus more on a parallel I found that made me really excited, and Jen urged us to find things that make us excited and go with it. So we're going to give it a shot. I'm a little nervous, but might as well learn something new, right? So for a little bit of context, last term I took the theory class, and for my final I wrote about post-colonialism, and the primary text I used was The Heart of Darkness for that paper and for that final. And when I was reading through this text just barely earlier this week, and I was rereading it today, there are a lot of similarities between the two concepts that made me really, really excited, because post-colonial theory is really interesting to me, especially the concept of the other. And in Benjamin Disraeli, in his portion, in his excerpt from Sybil that we had to read this week, one of the characters talks about how there are two nations in England at the time, in the Victorian era, and it says two nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones, or inhabitants of different planets, who are formed by a different breeding, are fed by a different food, are ordered by different manners, and are not governed by the same laws. And he talks about how the two nations are the rich and the poor. And post-colonial theory operates between two nations as well. There's the colonizing nation, and then there's the nation being colonized. And in both situations, in the industrial texts we're reading and in the post-colonial text, it's usually those who are upper class Englishmen, or just those who are upper class with a Eurocentric ideal for monetary gain and for power domestically and abroad. And it's just really interesting. I keep saying that, and I'm really sorry, but it is. So, a lot of the similarities that I found came from Friedrich Engels' text. He talks a lot about the situation that the people are in monetarily and domestically, and the incredibly terrible, deplorable state that they're living. And the very, very last line of his portion on page 1108, this is what really sparked the similarity for me. He said, "Industry alone has been responsible for all this," talking about the deplorable situations and the sort of slavery of a kind that they've been put in. So industry alone has been responsible for all this, and yet this same industry could not flourish except by degrading and exploiting the workers. And in industrial texts and in colonial texts, these upper class rich people could not be in those situations if it weren't for the people that they have working for them in ridiculously terrible circumstances that they're barely paying anything. They wouldn't be where they are without them, but they're not in a situation where they're going to acknowledge that those who are in such terrible circumstance are worth anything to them. They're so removed, they're in such a different situation that they're not going to acknowledge each other. And this is where the concept of other really comes in, because according to the Eurocentric ideal, anybody who is other is somebody that isn't civilized. It's a foreign place. it's in need of fixing. It needs the Eurocentric ideal to make it become what it could be, which is a money-making machine. And so the poor nation is pitted against the rich nation, and the poor nation of England is the other, even though they're actually fellow countrymen. They're not. And that's where one of the similarities lies. Let me find this part. I'm sorry, I thought I had it ready to go. So the other in post-colonial texts is usually, they're described as savages, people living, I know in the Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad and Marlowe, and those kind of become a complicated relationship on who's saying what. But it describes Africa as this blank canvas, as something in need of civilization and improvement, something really archaic, sort of, and often refers to the savage nature of the land and of the people that Marlowe comes across. And Dickens, in his excerpt from Hard Times, when he's talking about Coketown, it says it was a town of red brick, or of brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. So Dickens has established for us that the rich nation is the savage nation. In the eyes of, the poor nation is a savage nation in the eyes of the rich nation. One point in which the two approaches are actually not similar is in terms of identity. So, in post-colonial text, using Heart of Darkness as the example, Marlowe doesn't give any unique identifying factors to the Africans that he comes across. He often describes them as a black mass. At one point he refers to them as Angles, because they're so scrawny, their bones, they're not getting the food that they need to survive the work that they're being put through. So he calls them Angles. Nothing really identifying. He doesn't focus on age. He doesn't give him any kind of signifying marker from person to person. And in the Heart of Darkness, he meets one white man. He calls him the Swede. And in that one name, he's given that man more identity than he's given any of the dozens of people he had met to that point, because this man was white. That was the only individual he had focused on up to that point. And in these industrial texts, it's actually all about the individual. The interesting thing is, these individuals, although they're going through the same horrifying experience and being exploited the same way, there's no camaraderie as a result of that. And that's discussed a couple times in the texts that we read this week. So, going back to the excerpt from Sybil, Disraeli says, "In great cities, men are brought together by the desire of gain." And that's apparent in the industrial texts. People are trying to earn as much money as they can while being worked to death. He goes on to say, "They are not in a state of cooperation, but of isolation, as to the making of fortunes, and for all the rest, they are careless of neighbors." And Friedrich Engels also talks about this weird relationship that people have amongst each other. This excerpt is kind of long, but I think it illustrates really well what he saw, because in his part, he described the physical situations that people were in Manchester, and he describes the relationships that people had as well. So on 1102, about halfway through the paragraph, He says, hundreds of thousands of men and women drawn from all classes and ranks of society pack the streets of London. Are they not all human beings with the same innate characteristics and potentialities? Are they not all equally interested in the pursuit of happiness? And do they not all aim at happiness by following similar methods, yet they rush past each other as if they had nothing in common? They are tacitly agreed on one thing only, that everyone should keep to the right of the pavement so as not to collide with the stream of people moving in the opposite direction. At the end of the paragraph, he says, the disintegration of society into individuals, each guided by his private principles and each pursuing his own aims, has been pushed to its furthest limits in London. Here, indeed, human society has been split into its component atoms. And these component atoms form to create these two big countries of rich and poor. And the final point of comparison that I think ties the similarities really, really close is who the poor nations and those who are being colonized work for. So in the industrial text, the poor are being colonized into these slums in order to make the rich people richer. And in colonial text, the foreign lands, those being colonized, are doing so to exploit their own land in order to make various European countries more rich and more powerful. Usually the British Empire. And in Friedrich Engels' piece, just a paragraph below the one I just read, the very last sentence says, it talks about neighbors exploiting each other, and it says, the strongest of all, a tiny group of capitalists, monopolize everything, while the weakest, who are in the vast majority, succumb to the most abject poverty. And that's apparent in colonial texts as well, because there are these large groups of people being colonized, and they're being led by just a couple of the representatives from Europe. They're not necessarily being led by armies who can outnumber them. They've just convinced these large groups that what these small groups of white men say is most important and they're most powerful. And they carry the biggest stick, essentially. And it's just kind of fascinating to me that it is such a tiny group of capitalists that monopolize everything. In my paper about Heart of Darkness and Post-Colonial Theory, Jesse Oak Taylor talks about how the face of the white men became a sort of currency in colonization. And I think that's apparent in the industrial text as well, but it was the face of the rich white man, because the face of the poor white man was actually darkened through the filth that he lived in, which ties them together, because a lot of times the other is represented in darkness and in shadow because it's unknown, it's obscure. The poor are also unknown. The poor are also obscured. They're not understood by the rich, and they're physically obscured by all the dirt that they were forced to live in. I just thought this was all really interesting, so I'm sorry if this is not as interesting to you. I just want to finish up with more of what Friedrich has in his portion of the reading that we had. He talks about, he went through and talked about Manchester and all of the terrible, terrible situations that they're living in, that people were just slammed into these houses. There wasn't room for anyone. It was filthy everywhere. They had to wade through so much dirt and disgustingness in order to survive. And he says, it is only excuse me, it is only modern industry which permits these owners to take advantage of the poverty of the workers, to undermine the health of thousands to enrich themselves. That's very apparent in industrial texts and in colonial texts. Only industry has made it possible for workers who have barely emerged from a state of serfdom to be again treated as chattels and not as human beings. The workers have been caged in dwellings which are so wretched that no one else will live in them, and they actually pay good money for the privilege of seeing these dilapidated hovels fall to pieces about their ears. And then the last line that I read before, industry alone has been responsible for all of this, and yet this same industry could not flourish except by degrading and exploiting the workers. And it's the exploitation of the workers that allows this weird cycle to continue on. And I just thought the connections were too important to not address. It's as if colonialism had a test run at home. And that the small group of capitalists wanted to make sure that people would buy into the power that they were professing that they had, before they went abroad to attempt to dominate another group, a different kind of group, for their monetary gain, for their economic, for their political gain. I hope this has made sense. I'm sorry if it hasn't. Go ahead and ask me questions. I will hopefully be able to explain it. I'm a lot better at conversations and explaining it because there's immediate feedback. So hopefully this wasn't too torturous. And I will try to post the quotes below. I'll post a quote from Jessie Oak Taylor that I referenced in my paper. Yeah, hopefully this made sense. I will talk to you later.